my people? What's good? I know it's I know it's been a while, but I've been a bit busy. Let me turn this game down. I've been a bit busy. As for example, the name change. So we are now current ancestors, in which we actually are. Honestly, all this stuff going on in the world, it's been quite the show. And I'm not just talking about right now because this stuff has been going on for a long time. We are, of course, going to always keep it or keep this historical, whether we at politics, economics, religion, whatever it may be. It's always going to circle back to history here. And the reason it will always circle back to history, because whether it's here or whether it's there, history does repeat itself. All this stuff going on today goes back years and years, but it's just now getting recognition from us because it's in our hands. It's kind of virtual. We learn this stuff easier, from gods to governments, and today we're just watching history repeat itself again. But this isn't new. This is ancient. The same struggle for control, resources, and dominance that once belonged to the gods now belong to the nations. So let's start with the talk of the world, what I feel is probably one of the most important things to focus on right now. And that's, of course, the war between, the nations, Israel, Iran, and America. I mean, we kind of joined in on it, and I'm literally saying joined in on it because that's what happens. It don't have nothing to do with my political belief, being that I don't even have one. Now, to really understand this, we got to go way back, like back to the beginning of the shift of polytheism to monotheism. It's deep, and trust me, this will connect some dots and questions to you for the wise. Israel didn't start as a country. It started as a name, a man who wrestled with God. And today that same struggle continues, just not with angels, but with nations. Ancient historical research tells us that before Israel, it was the land of the Canaanites, called Canaan, around 3000 to 2500 BCE, I think. That's correct, but somewhere around that date span. Now, monotheism isn't a big thing at this point, and the ancient people of the Levant, which would be Israel, Palestine region today, were a polytheistic society. Their main god was El, the supreme father god. And if you take it back to pre-Hebraic times, it's believed that the word Israel means El strives or El rules, somewhere along those lines. So even the name Israel began with ancient roots to El, not yet Yahweh. Now, we will get deeper into Yahweh later because, trust me, it's gonna be a long one, but you'll love it. Yahweh was essentially tied to storms, war, and wilderness as a god varying based on tradition. Before we go into the gods themselves, let's actually see what the Canaanite people were like based on the data that we have. So the Canaanites were a group of ancient Semitic people residing mainly in the region we call now Israel, Palestine, Lebanon, and parts of Syria. They weren't one empire. They were like many kingdoms or city-states. They pop up in Egyptian, Phoenician, and cuneiform sources. They still shared the same language, cultures, and religions, but they were still politically separated and independent. Their religious practices consisted of prayer, worship, rituals, sacrifices, altars, shrines, and so on, with gods being linked to divine forces, a kingdom in the sky, struggles, and a supreme god. Now, how did the Israelites come from the Canaanites? In the late Bronze Age, a highland region between the coastal plains and the Jordan Valley had about 30 settlements. And as the Iron Age started to emerge, about 250 settlements seem to have popped up. So a new community popped up in the highlands around the same time as the beginning of Israel, which does not mean that those people were Israelites, but it puts them at the right time and place for a cultural bend. The earliest known reference to Israel is the Merneptah stele from the late 13th century BCE of Egypt, referencing Israel among people defeated by Merneptah. Merneptah was the Egyptian pharaoh, son of Ramses II, and the Merneptah stele is a stone inscription written in hieroglyphs detailing his victories from war. A key detail that gets focused on that tablet is the way Israel is written. It's referring to a certain people rather than a kingdom, which was interpreted to most likely be in the land of Canaan. But it does not exclude that there were also restrictions that there were also no restrictions or bans on travel at that time. So many Israelites were in Egypt, as were they in the land of Canaan. Now, during this time, Egypt had control over Canaan, and about 150 to 200 years before Merneptah, there was a pharaoh named Akhenaten. And Akhenaten introduced the first thought of monotheism by mandating worship to the one god, Aten, the sun disk. Now, there is no direct connection between the Israelites adopting Aten or the idea of monotheism coming from Akhenaten, but there is an indirect connection based on Egypt's control over Canaan, giving room for the idea to have, spread through travel between the nations. But after Akhenaten's reign ended, so did the monotheistic mandate over Egypt, and his son Tutankhamun quickly changed the society back to polytheistic, as it had been before. But you have to think some people most likely stuck to that monotheistic theory that Akhenaten put out there. Very possible. But let's keep going. As time goes on into Merneptah's reign, Egypt starts to lose its grip as the dominant superpower, and we have evidence of this from the Amarna letters, which are tablets sent to Egypt from local kings and nations asking for help from invaders, outsiders, and rebels who could have connections to the early Israelites. Not saying they are, just saying they could have connections. In 1200 BCE, the Bronze Age collapsed, leaving Egypt weakened and the Canaanite system totally destroyed. And this is where the Merneptah stele shows up with the first mention of Israel. So Israel most likely didn't just show up. It emerged through the chaos and the downfall around all of the Canaanite kingdoms and society. Now that we have gone through the beginning, let's talk about how they start to emerge into their own way of life as we knew it, or that we know it today even. So the early Israelite population starts to gather in the hill country of Canaan, building simple homes and villages, focusing on family survival. So they are a humble, survival-based society at this point. They're not fully monotheistic yet. So what made them different from their surrounding neighbors? They're coming into monotheism, but not everybody is just fully monotheistic. Just remember I said that they emerged from the Canaanites. So what made them different? For starters, Yahweh was essentially tied to storms, war, and wilderness, like I said before. And Yahweh became their choice God of worship rather than the other gods, even though they were still acknowledged. So others existed, they just chose not to follow them. Another thing is they did not eat pork, but before that was a religious law, it may have just been a real issue and hassle to livestock pigs, because the region they settled in was not necessarily ideal for pigs because they don't graze like sheep and goats. Pigs actually also need 2 times more water than feed. They don't produce milk or wool, so it would be more of a liability to have pigs in that area. So this was something that most likely started off as general life, circumstances and formed into a religious ideal that later became like a statement piece of their identity, which separated them from their swine-eating peers, I guess. And the reason we know this is because the archaeological finds show that there were almost little to no pig bones in that region compared to the neighboring territories. At this point, Israel is just a group of tribes, no central government or system. So through the biblical narrative, we get that Israel is formed from the ancestor Jacob, who wrestled with God, and they become the 12 tribes of his sons. And the historical and the biblical side do coexist. One just tells who the people believe they are, and one tells how they came to be. Now, let me chill. But more villages start to grow along the population as time moves on, and they start becoming rooted in communities, and they start to have conflict with the remaining Canaanite groups and Philistines, leading to the tribes forming alliances and starting to cooperate. And certain individuals, like great warriors, start to become leaders, as we read in the book of Judges. Now, in the Bible, tells a story in a straight line from Jacob to Moses to David, who is also mentioned in the Merneptah still. But historical data tells us a different story of people forming in the land at the same time, while others are coming out of Egypt and the Philistines are starting to press in at the same time. So everything is literally happening at the same time. As for Jacob and Moses, the enslavement of a large group of Israelites in Exodus, there isn't any historical data to back it up. Not saying that it is not true, though. Historical data just gives Israelites emerging from the land of Canaan, like I said, rather than showing up there later after the liberation described in the Bible. But back to the main line. The Philistines ain't letting up, and the tribes are now realizing that they need a permanent leader, so they create an organized monarchy, a system of kings, queens, going down the line. Now, this is where we start to incorporate some biblical evidence of a ruling house from the Tel dynasty, resulting in cities starting to grow to more than just small villages with the new system. So Israel is not the biggest power, but they are stronger, organized, and recognized. But as you know, with the growth of kingdoms comes division. And they divide into the northern kingdom, which is Israel, and the southern kingdom, which is Judah. The northern kingdom, Israel, was bigger and more dynamic of the two, but it was unstable with political power changing and no long-term dynasties. And as for the lower kingdom, Judah, they kept one continuous dynasty centered around Jerusalem, but their less fertile land and smaller population made them less wealthy. As time goes on, the Assyrian Empire conquered Israel because they were the dominant power in that region. And the Assyrians did not just all out conquer because they followed an organized system that involved first offering Israel an ultimatum. And that ultimatum was basically paying tribute. And if you refused, then they would just conquer you and deport your population around the region to prevent rebellion and break identities in order to gain like ultimate control over a conquered territory. And this is what happened to Israel when they faced the Assyrians. They basically said, nah, we ain't just gonna submit. So they started deporting them and breaking up. When you deport people to unknown areas, they start to coexist with the people they're around through generations, and that identity becomes lost. That's why the Assyrians basically, let me just talk about it now. So it's a very well coordinated and put together strategy that's still happening today. Like I told you, the systems and governments, they don't just pull these ideas from the sky. It's all been done before, and they do know history. And if we all knew about this stuff, we would already know what they were going to do before they do it, because they are actually just stuck on repeat, just like we are. Basically taking a large part of a conquered population, not all, but a large part of it and moving those people to a whole other conquered region, while also replacing those people with people from different conquered regions. You know what I mean? Like, they conquered Israel, moved them to, I don't know, Babylon or something like that, and take the people from Babylon that they conquered and move them to Israel or wherever else they conquered. And basically, when you move people from their land, culture, and traditions to be among another group of people with totally different perspectives and traditions, it makes it harder for them to revolt because they would be too busy fighting among each other. And I'm pretty sure that makes sense to all of us because it's happening today. Not only was deportation a big part in stopping the people from revolting, but also they were able to get skilled workers in the areas that they needed them. Which increased the Assyrian economic gain. So this is actually a very strategic system that people who lived in 900 BC, who are supposed to be 10 times dumber than us, organized. So many Israelites got deported, especially in the northern region, which was Israel, and this is where the 10 lost tribes of Israel comes from. Now, in the lower region, Judah, the deportation wasn't as massive as in Israel, the northern region. So Judah most likely just submitted to being controlled. Hey, it's better than, what I'm saying, going through what happened to them in Israel, I guess. So they said, hey, we'll just take whatever y'all give. As for where the people of Israel ended up being deported to was basically areas around the Assyrian Empire today. That would be like Iraq, Syria, Iran. This is more specific to the northern part, Israel, like I said, rather than Judah. They kind of disappear from clear history and assimilating to the place where they were taken into. I mean, losing clear identity, and that's why they are called the lost tribes. And for Judah, they were controlled until the Assyrian Empire weakened, and then the Babylonians came in and destroyed their empire and deported them, but they were not scattered like the tribes of Israel. They were all actually taken to one place in Babylon and stayed connected as a group until they eventually returned. So after the Assyrians were out of command, the Babylonians, they came in and it was like, we gonna do the same thing, but y'all can stay together, we ain't tripping like that. We ain't gonna split your families up and stuff. But yeah. So this was also where the term Jew comes from, because it's just a description for a person from Judah. And the exile from their land probably strengthened the monotheistic claim, because when you lose everything, all you have left is your belief. When there are no temples, portable worship comes into play, for example, in the form of symbols and scriptures. And when there is no land tied to your God becomes universal. Now, after Babylon. Now, after Babylon fell, the Persian Empire took over, and they had a more lenient system under Cyrus the Great, who was even called God's anointed in the book of Isaiah in the Bible, which is why people of Judah were allowed to return to their land to start rebuilding. But some of them spread out to different parts of the world, like Egypt, and some even stayed in Babylon, which made their identity no longer tied to land. But Cyrus was not a known worshiper of Yahweh. Even that I said they called Cyrus God's anointed. No indication that he was a worshiper of Yahweh. So the land was, of course, in ruins, but they started rebuilding, and instead of appointing one individual to rule over them, this time they appointed the scripture, the law, the Torah itself as its governing body. Here's the thing. They didn't just return to empty land. There were locals already there. And these people are the people we refer to as the Samaritans. If you can remember earlier, we discussed deportation. Now, the Samaritans weren't just people who were deported to Israel. They were a mix of deportees and Israelites who were not exiled, and they came to form their own version of the Torah and religious law. Both of these groups are Israelites, but the returning Israelites were not so welcoming to people who were not a part of their tight-knit community. And can you really blame them after years of exile only to return to some people in your house? You know what I'm saying? And you like, but you know what I'm saying? After years of exile, they were unsure if these people in their homeland were even their true descendants of the ancient Israelites. So there is some conflict between these groups. The conflict isn't even over land. It's more so a claim of name. Basically, both groups are laying claim to being the true Israelites. Also, where's the right place to worship God? You know, the Samaritans say Mount Gerizim and the Judeans say Jerusalem. And this creates a long-term hostility. They worshiped the same God, followed the same law, claimed the same ancestors, but built different temples and chose different centers of power. Does that sound familiar? One of the most important people during this era was called John, Hyrcanus, or Hyrcanus. His Hebrew name was Yohanan, meaning Yahweh is gracious. John is the Greek English form of Yohanan. So maybe I should just stick with Yohanan, but I don't know. I like to keep trying to pronounce this stuff. After Persia, the Greek Empire gained control of Israel region. So we had, let's go in order. We had the Assyrians first, then we had the Babylonians, then we had the Persians. Now we have the Greek Empire. The Greek Empire gained control over the Israel region, and they were not like Cyrus. So they tried to force Hellenization and the Greek practices on the Jewish people while also banning Jewish practices. This is known as the Seleucid era, and it created a religious crisis. A priestly family rose to power led by Judah Maccabee, sometimes called Judas, and this name means the hammer. He was a Jewish religious leader and military general who led the revolt against the Seleucid Empire, which preserved Judaism under foreign rule and inspired the celebration of Hanukkah. After the revolt, the Maccabees became the ruling house of Judea, which is called the Hasmonean dynasty, about 26 years later after John Hyrcanus, the nephew of Judah, becomes the leader of Judea. So John or Yohanan, we should say Yohanan because that's easier to say, but John Hyrcanus is the nephew of Judah Maccabee. I don't want nobody to get lost. So now, about 26 years later, John becomes the leader of Judea, and his mission becomes to unify and secure the Jewish identity as a whole, since the identity crisis had not been resolved yet. So he expands their territory by conquering surrounding nations and forcing the assimilation, requiring foreign nations to adopt Jewish identity to form centralized power. So he feels that survival has been their downfall at this point, and now he sees that they need to resort to domination like the people who've been conquering them. They need to resort to that to stop them from basically walking through this revolving door of being conquered over and over and over again. One of the key events that he is known for is destroying the Samaritan temple, which left only the temple in Jerusalem, removing the rival claim to true Israel. And after this, the relationship between the Jewish people and the Samaritans become hostile and permanent, making them basically avoid each other. It's not so much as hostile today for these two groups in today's time, but the history remains on their consciousness. So Jewish independence only lasted about 100 years because of internal conflict and uprising over the power of the throne by John's successors, who were actually his sons, which led to a foolish invitation of an outside power into their conflict. Can you guess who's next? If you said Rome, you got it. Yep, leading to Rome now conquering them. So we had the Assyrians, we had the Babylonians, we had the Persians, we had the Greeks, and then for about 100 years they were chilling, and then here come the Romans. So they ain't never really had their own land at this point still. So The Romans came in, conquered them, and now they are under Roman control. And Jewish independence is over with. Romans started a puppet king to control them, and this was Herod the Great. He did things to win the Jewish people over sometimes, but he also ruled with an iron fist and was described as a very paranoid person, which led to people feeling powerless again, with hopes for a Messiah to come and free them once more, just like Cyrus. Now, this was what we have all been waiting for: the birth of Yeshua, or Jesus. Jesus is born around the end of Herod's reign, and we'll go slow, giving a full detail of Jesus from birth to end based on historical data, because you'll realize how important Jesus actually plays in this role, and that's why Jesus, or Yeshua, is still so revered today. In this Gospel of Matthew, people, including Herod, are stated to know about the birth of Jesus, but there is no historical data of this. But it's possible, being that Herod was described to have a little paranoia thing about him, is possible. But historically, almost nobody knew about the birth of Jesus. So in the Bible, it says that everybody knew, he brought gifts, all types of stuff. Historically, we just don't have proof that anybody knew that Jesus was about to be born. Now, by the time Jesus was born and growing up, Rome had let go of the puppet leaders, and they placed the Roman governor Pontius Pilate as the leader. And he wasn't playing those games. It wasn't about appealing to nobody. He don't care about your Jewish or your religion, or if you're a Christian, or whatever you are. If you worship Zeus still, Pontius don't care, man. Pontius ruled with just the iron fist, straight up. And he wasn't paranoid. But back to Jesus, or Yeshua. I'll be mainly saying Jesus so everyone understands. Now, Jesus was a mysterious birth that's described in the Holy Text. He was born from the Virgin Mary after she had been visited by the Holy Spirit. Now, as for historical data, guess what? There ain't no trace of Jesus having a biological father. I don't think there ever will be, because, we don't even have anything left of Jesus that we know of yet, alone with any DNA be available if we did have any remains. So not every question about the past can be answered with data. Some sit at the very edge of history and belief. Anyways, our oldest sources present Mary as his mother and Joseph as his household father, along with brothers and sisters, which most likely would have been little brothers and sisters. According to theology, that only made sense. In the biblical text, King Herod had ordered all children under the age of 2 in Bethlehem to be killed after he received a prophecy that the king of the Jews would be born, and Joseph was warned in a dream to leave, so they ended up fleeing to Egypt as described in Matthew chapters 1 and 2. It was a nearby uncontrolled area by Herod, and also had a large Jewish population, and they most likely stayed there until Herod died, which wasn't nothing but, I don't know, maybe a couple years or months according to historical data. He died in 4 BC, which would have made Jesus no older than 5. So they stayed in Egypt for a little bit, and after returning from Egypt, they settled in Nazareth. And Jesus grows up in a quiet, rural environment, likely learning craftsmanship from Joseph, along with scripture and tradition. And then it goes blank. For a while, it's nothing, until Jesus turns about the age of 12. And Luke describes of how he went to Passover in Jerusalem, and they stayed behind in the temple to talk among the priests. Then it goes blank again up until he is about 30. And this is what we call the hidden years. So from 12 to 30, definitely don't know according to theology and history, but we can only make guesses. When Jesus finally returns to story after 18 years, he gets baptized by his cousin John the Baptist, who had already been popularly preaching the work of Yahweh to the people. Now, I'm not going to tell the whole theological story of Jesus right now. I'm just trying to focus on the shifts and uprisings of Israel based on the historical data and research. Now, after John the Baptist baptized Jesus, Jesus went on to start his public life. And according to Josephus, who was a Jewish priest turned Roman historian, stated that he was executed by Herod the Great's son, Herod Antipas, who was the ruler of Galilee at the time. Josephus was one of the only voices from that time who described the world of Jesus from the outside. And he's not perfect, but without him, we know far less about what's really happening during that time of Jesus. So Jesus starts publicly teaching and gaining followers, and many are drawn to him, but many also feel threatened. For example, the ordained religious leaders who were already teaching the word of Yahweh. Eventually, Jesus ends up in Jerusalem, which is the center of Roman rule in that region, and now it starts to get intense because the coming of Jesus into Jerusalem also brought large crowds, which would put the Roman guards on like high alert. Now, Jesus is preaching about God's kingdom, which to the officials probably meant he was bringing about a new rule and a new order among the people. And the established leaders responsible for religious order become threatened and fearful that Rome will eventually step in, leading to everybody suffering. Now, the turning point is when Jesus caused a disruption in the temple and the courts. And the temple wasn't just religious, it was an economic place. And, once someone starts messing with the money, you know what happened. You can talk and all that, but once world leaders realize that you messing up their funds or something, it's over with. But yeah, Jesus flipped the tables, and he got they say he got gangster in that thing, criticizing the actions taking place, and this I guess this just couldn't be ignored by the religious leaders at that time. They was like, nah, he getting gangster in here on us, he stepping on us, he talking about what we doing wrong, we supposed to be the leaders, and he, but they were the elite religious leaders. They were called the Sadducees, I believe. Can't really remember if that's the right word. The Sadducees or the Sadducees, and they were like the elite religious puppets for Rome, and they basically ratted Jesus out to the Roman forces. So it wasn't just really one group ratting on Jesus. It was a whole system reacting to something that they saw as a threat. So they took the charges and accusations to Pontius Pilate, but they didn't tell the truth. They reframed it and said that Jesus was claiming to be the king of the Jews. They reframed it. They probably reframed it because Rome could most likely give two shits about blasphemy or the little religious authority dispute that they was having. But someone claiming to be a king of a territory in their territory, or a king of a people in their territory, no, you even do that. So Pilate now sees Jesus as a political threat and orders his crucifixion. After Jesus was crucified, the belief did exist that he rose from the dead, but there is no historical evidence of this act. Either way, the people believed it, and they were just a small group of his followers at this time. But as time continues, his followers began teaching and preaching and forming small communities beyond Jerusalem. So the movement had grown with the belief that Jesus had rose again, spread into non-Jewish communities, which were eventually called the Gentiles. At first, Rome generally ignored it, but later they start to feel kind of threatened by the growth of these communities, and occasional persecutions start to take place. So Rome generally thought it ended a movement, but instead it created one by executing the man, because basically you can execute the man, but the idea lived forever. And that's why I personally have a strong belief that you never actually really die until you are forgotten. So as long as one thing remembers you, you're still alive, because consciousness is the true essence of life, at least in this realm. But that's just my belief. So let's move on though. Even though communities have started to follow the word of Jesus, the Jewish temple leaders, they haven't. And they are not taking kindly to this movement. And social separation starts to take place again. And this involves the notion that now, since the message is spread beyond Jerusalem, a new identity group starts to form from the Gentiles without fully adopting the Jewish law. And this is the beginning of the Christians. After the execution of his followers, after the execution, his followers spread the message across Rome. And at that point, religion was tied to land, ethnicity, ritual, and status still. Now, traditional Judaism was also the same way, but the Jesus movement offered open arms for anyone to join. A God not tied to people, but open to all. Roman society was highly stratified, but the message of Jesus spoke to the poor, the weak, the vulnerable, which hit hard for most people, like slaves and women. Most religions were also transactional, as in ritual or sacrifice, but Jesus spoke of a direct connection with God, not requiring these things. Belief in the afterlife for most religions involve uncertainty or limits, but Jesus spoke a strong idea of resurrection and eternal life. So you could see why most would turn to worship this God instead of theirs. In a world full of status and identity, Jesus' message says that you belong, basically. Traditional Judaism required lineage, covenant, and law. Christianity is much simpler, with the one requirement being simply belief and to claim the title of Christian. Soon, Jerusalem was attacked and destroyed again by Roman forces, led by Titus, Emperor Titus. And in this process, thousands of Jews were killed or enslaved, and the ones who got away dispersed across the Roman Empire, the Middle East, and Africa. Years later, the Jews tried to revolt again, led by Simon Bar Kokhba. But Rome absolutely crushed them, resulting in many lives lost. The Romans then renamed the city Syria Palestina, or Syria Palestina. I don't know. But they renamed the city and banned Jews. So the Jews are decreasing at this point. Now, moving into the shift of the world to Christianity involves Roman Emperor Constantine. And around this time, in this point in history, Rome is starting to become unstable. They're having problems with civil wars, political wars, religious wars, everything. Before the Battle of Milvian Bridge, Constantine mysteriously had a vision involving the Christian symbol and connected victory with the Christian God, and issued the Edict of Milan, making Christianity legal. At first, the Christians were persecuted, and now all of a sudden they are protected. Now, it's debated whether this was true belief, political strategy, or both. But either way, this was the main act that stabilized the Roman Empire. Sooner than later, Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire, and it isn't exactly the same Christianity anymore. Before, it was rooted in community, survival, and relief, but now it becomes institutional and connected to government, authority, and law. The church and state begin to merge, which means that emperors start to influence church and religious decisions, and church leaders gain political power. Is this too much for you yet? Or should I keep going? It's almost like I'm reading present day actions of the world out loud. Now, none of this is new. None of this is new. It went from God shaping people to the people shaping the empire. You ever seen an empire try to stop something and then turn around and help it build for their own agenda? Yeah, we see it every day. Then guess what? The Muslims took over Jerusalem. But so we see another taking over, being controlled again. So that's 6. Now the Muslims take over Jerusalem. But they let the Jews finally return in peace to Jerusalem and practice their faith. Then years later, the Christians went to take over Jerusalem to gain and try and claim Holy Land. So we see a revolving door of the overtaking of Jerusalem. And guess what? They conquered it, but not first without killing thousands of Muslims and Jews. This order was issued by Pope Urban II for religious control, economic control, and political control. Muslims eventually took it back at some point, but it caused a big strife between all groups at that point. And like I said, the church got involved in these affairs. What is a pope doing calling a war? You know what I'm saying? But at the end of the day, the Muslims took them over, but the Jews, they just, for some reason, they keep getting conquered by certain nations. And you have to think about what's going on. I'm not going to speak too much on it because, like I said, I want to keep it historical. But that's 7 times. You start with the Assyrians, then you move to the Babylonians, then you move to the Persians, then you move to the Greeks. Then what, they had 100 years of peace, and then the Romans came, and then the Muslims came, and then the Christians came, took over the land. So the land just keeps getting taken over. So, and the crazy part is that, like I said, all of this ties into the modern era. Government still using religion for legitimacy, and religion still influences laws and politics. That's basically what you see. They say, the flag, the pledge, every nation just about has this religious cooperation into their politics. But yeah, you have to realize as much power as much as power controls belief, beliefs can absolutely control power. Why? Because religion keeps people organized, and it's easier to govern at that point. So even though many countries and states, they may claim religious separation, it's not true. We see it. For instance, here in the U.S., we have marriage laws, abortion laws, educational debates about it. The pledge, it literally says one nation under God. So, yeah. From ancient Israel to modern nations, the story, it never changed. Belief shapes identity, identity shapes power, and power shapes the world. Now let's tie this back to the gods. We discussed a little bit in the beginning. Now, before Yahweh was the only God, there was a council of gods throughout the Canaanite culture. And remember, the Israelites came out of the Canaanite culture, later distinguishing themselves as Israelites. The main head god was El. The rest of the gods were likely considered children or descendants of El. That is why El is associated with Israel. And El is at some of the names of the people connected to the divine, like Samuel El and Daniel, with El at the end of the name. So El does not disappear when Yahweh comes. El is basically absorbed into Yahweh along with the other gods. Now let's get deep on this subject, and we might tap a little bit of sensitivity. Archaeological research found inscriptions in the tomb that mention Yahweh with Asherah. Asherah is the Canaanite mother goddess, often viewed as the consort of El. In some communities, Yahweh was worshipped alongside Asherah. So was El before the shift in the supreme godship. This isn't made up either. This was a real practice among ordinary people, although it does not mean that all of the Israelites officially believed this, but it does have a strong case that early Israelites were not uniformly monotheistic. But of course, later biblical writers reject this. But catch this though. Early biblical texts actually speak of divine beings like a council of gods of some sort. Psalm 82 speaks of God standing in assembly and judging other gods for the neglect of the vulnerable, declaring that they will end up dying like humans because of their corruption. This echoes the structure of a council of gods from like a polytheistic polytheistic standpoint. But wait, there's more. In Deuteronomy, which is the final book of the Old Testament, it speaks on Elyon dividing nations and assigning different gods to their own nation. Now, here's the kick. Deuteronomy chapter 32, verses 8 and 9. It says that Yahweh's personal portion and inheritance is Israel. So you can put up who Elyon is for debate, but my hypothesis on that is that Elyon is El, the high god of the Canaanite religion. Like I said earlier, El and all of the other gods eventually get absorbed into Yahweh as Yahweh becomes stronger. I like to think about it like the overthrow of a government by internal regime or something. Like, I'm not done yet. I got one more thing, and I'm pretty sure everybody heard this one before. But in Genesis 1:26, God says, "Let us make humanity," and who is us? I give my hypothesis on who is us when God says, "Let us make humanity." Us is the other gods. If you go back to Sumerian mythology, which is just an example of many that I just have. I like Sumerian, and I have this one off the top of the dome. But it's an example of many other myths from different civilizations. The gods worked together to create humanity. In Sumerian, you have Enki. He created humans with the help of Nintu. What this tells us is that the myth patterns are basically carried forward and reframed. Research as an archaeology and the study of the culture tells us what people actually did. The text shows us what writers wanted people to believe. People come to tell you what they believe. I mean, you don't have to believe it. I listen to people, but I always go back and do my own research, as everybody should. And if you do, you might realize something. If you check out stuff that be talking about this kind of stuff or read about it, whatever. But whether society was monotheistic or polytheistic, the same stuff that is happening today, it happened back then. Whether there were 10 gods or one, or animal spirits, or whatever people decided to worship, the same stuff has always been happening, and it came from somewhere. It could have been at the point that our minds awakened, like when the devil insisted that Adam and Eve eat the fruit, or when Prometheus stole the fire from Zeus and gave it to human beings. The people were told to create a system based on status and control of some sort by the gods or a god in every text created about religion and tradition. There were many gods, but one god always wanted ultimate control throughout every text, and that is the same way our world is today. At first, it was just the head of the family, and conflict or trade made families eventually join forces, to help each other, but that came with the result of a leader of a clan or tribe. And then conflict over who should be leader came into play, so they ended up separating, forming more clans and going to war, resulting in the winner gaining more territory. And then the same thing happens over and over again until cities form into states form into countries, and countries end up forming into nations. And how was all this conflict justified as good behavior? Through the leadership of religion. Monotheism coming into play made it easier to lead and control a very large territory rather than just a small section of people. The specific Hebrew religion offers a welcome to anyone after Jesus delivers the message. And it also gives a nuance that there is no defeating this God because there are no specific ties to a land. See, in other nations, once your land was conquered, so is your God. Religion was equal territory, you know what I'm saying? Plus power before Yahweh became the only God. When the Israelites made the claim that there is no other God but their God and chose not to acknowledge that other nations had their own God also, they broke an ancient pattern and started a new world, basically. Now, instead of wars being placed under the instruction of a God, wars are listed under the notions of economic, nationalistic, and survival of some sort. Both reasons still represent power and control. One just hides it a lot better because it had to be way easier to know just lie and say we did this for our God, than to lie and say, we did it for oil or whatever. But at the same time, a world leadership formed with monotheism rather than a polytheistic society of separation and non-cooperation. So everything has a good side and a bad side. Monotheism did bring cultures closer and made people friendlier toward each other, but it also has been used as a chess piece. I've been going on for a while about this, and I think we'll just stop it right here. So thank you for coming through to check out what I have to say, and remember, go check out currentancestors.com, and I have way more Tough Rugs coming out soon, and also more content coming out soon, more blogs, everything. But yeah, go check it out, and I will catch y'all on the flip side.